Hello, class, and welcome to another episode of Eddy's Workshop. This is a show where I walk you through various stages of developments at Onyx Path Publishing. Um, Off the bat, I want to apologize a little bit if I sound a little strange. I just got back from getting three fillings put into my teeth, so my jaw is numb. I can't even feel any of that. And I thought it was a good idea to have dental surgery right before a Twitch stream because I am the best at planning. But one of the things I'm hoping that we can do with this is just show how you can get better at planning if you were to ever become a developer of your own role-playing game or working at Onyx Path Publishing. And also, even if you're an Onyx or a freelancer or just curious about the process, I'm hoping that we can kind of demystify a lot of what the process is like. And today is going to be a big one. Today we're going to talk primarily about red lines. For those of you who don't know, what red lines are is what we call the process where a developer or an editor gives feedback to the writer after the first draft. I'm going to give some context around redlining, but it's a big part of what makes or breaks a book in a lot of ways. So let's kind of go right into the process chart here. For those of you who watched last week, this will be familiar to you. Last episode, we talked primarily about the design column, which is right here, and that was mainly about pitches and outlines and what the book was actually going to become initially, or what the idea was before the book actually gets made. Today, we're going to focus on production. Red lines is the key topic here, but really a lot of what we're going to talk about here is going to be everything leading up to that too. So once a book is outlined, the outline is approved, everyone's on board with what the outline is going to be. The next step is to hire writers. And when a developer goes to hire writers, one of the things they need to think about is what kind of flavor and tone is this writer going to bring to the project. Part of the reason for that is it's let me step back a little bit. One of the things that is good to know about, we talk about in writing games, is what's called house style. If you hear references sometimes to things that we talk about, our style guide or our style document, which is how the words generally are lined up. Our editors use these style documents to edit to our standard, and writers ideally will be writing to that style as well. So it's things like the fact that we use the serial or Oxford comma, the fact that we have spaces around our em dashes. There are certain phrasings we like to prefer and others we don't. We tend to prefer active voice, all of these things. But there's a more subtle thing to that, is that all the books in the game line generally will have a certain tone or feel to them. Onyx Path books, generally, if you pick up one and pick up another in their game line, its odds are pretty good you'll get a similar sense out of them. But a Dystopia Rising book is going to read differently than a Realms of Pugmire book, which is going to read differently than a Scion book. And ideally, what's happening there is that the line developer, the in-house developer, or the project developer, whoever is ultimately responsible for this game line, is going to explain to the writers, this is the tone we're looking for in a game. So to give an example, in the first Pugmire book, I wrote the game mostly in a relatively neutral tone, but occasionally I did first-person asides, which is something that we don't usually do in Onyx Path books. I would say, I, Eddy Webb, have a thought about this thing. And the idea at the time was, because this is my product, this is my baby, I wanted to give people a sense of I was talking to them about this game that we're excited about. After that first book, we kind of fell away from the eye focusing, because I wasn't writing all books myself. It became a little weird, and also just some people didn't really groove on it because it was so discordant with the established Onyx Path style. So even if you don't recognize what house style is, as a reader or as a player, you might suddenly go, oh, this sounds odd. And what you're running up against is that even if it's perfectly parsable English, if it's perfectly clear, if it doesn't, quote unquote, feel right, that's house style. And so when the developers bring writers in, ideally the writers are going to be writing within the house style. But you also want to hire writers sometimes for very strategic reasons, and you want them to bring something to the table that another writer won't. So, for example, if I'm hiring someone like, say, Matthew Dawkins to a project, it's because I know that he has a very good a balance of things that can be entertaining, but he's going to layer all of this stuff in with really cool, interesting tidbits. He's going to try to think of all sorts of ways to enrich the world when he's writing things, come up with what he calls plot hooks. He's going to bring a slight dry wit to a project, and also a sense of creepiness that might be important. All of those things, he is a very flexible writer, so any of those things might be the reason why I'd bring him on board. Whereas a newer writer may not know their style as much, so probably initially I'm bringing them on board and hoping to kind of get them to go into more explicitly the Onyx Path house style or the line style, and make sure that they're contributing appropriately to that game. So there's a lot of different reasons why I bring people on board, but then over time, it's going to be they have a better experience, they have a different lived experience, or they have a different a tenor or flavor, and you want to bring some of that out within the constraints of the house style. So there's actually a lot of challenge, or I should say at least thought, that goes into assembling the right writing team for a project. These days, I generally, if it's not a core book, I generally try to get at least one writer that's new to me on a project whenever possible. I try to get relatively diverse breakdown of a gender identity, lived region, people of color if possible. And that's not always possible. Sometimes my ideal writer team, people can't make it, they're not interested, they can't make the commitment work, whatever. Sometimes you bring on writers because they're your second or third choice. Doesn't mean you think any less of them. It's just there's only so many slots on a book, and you want to get as many of those people onto the project that makes sense as possible. Let me give a brief sidebar, actually. There's this conceit, this idea that persists both with new developers and with fans, that if you put more writers on a book, somehow that makes the book go faster. And it's just not true. In fact, the opposite is true in my experience. Because when I show you kind of this redlining process, if I am redlining 6 writers, I'm looking at 6 different chunks of a book. And each of those are going to have their own unique problems and things I have to wrestle with as a developer. But ultimately, I'm only changing gears 6 times. If I hire 14 writers, I have to do that 14 times. So there are a lot of people who have all sorts of different things, and if person 9 did something that I realized how much the person 1 has to do, I have to go back and rewrite that component. There's a lot of more moving parts involved. Of those 14, there's a more chance that people will fall off or not be able to contribute on time, or just isn't going to work out for some other reason. And on top of all of that, when you contract writers, you give them the outline, they're all going to go off and start writing. If you have a lot of people, they have to collaborate more, which means there are more people who may or may not be talking to each other. And the time you're giving them doesn't change. If I hire 2 writers versus 50 writers, they still have 8 weeks or whatever to write. So adding more writers doesn't make that go faster. It just means that they have pretty much the same amount of time, but now I have even more complexity on top of that. That doesn't mean there's not good reasons to have multiple writers in a project. In fact, I think for some projects, having a half dozen to a dozen writers is sometimes correct. Something you want to get more voices on it, or if it's just a really big book and if everyone going to pick up 5 to 1,000 words and you have a 250,000 word book, that's a lot of writers you have to get board to make everything covered. So there's a lot of things that go into that, and as Yudam points out, video games have this problem too. A lot of video game producers, the joke I've heard when I was a producer was that you can't have 9 mothers to have a baby in 1 month. But a lot of producers feel like that's how you can solve problems. But sometimes cutting your team down actually makes things go faster because there's less points of complexity. And this really does come out a lot in the redline process specifically. So I'll get into that, but just to start off with, the idea is you put an outline together. That outline, ideally, at least the ones I write, tend to have the deadlines on there. This is the deadlines, your first drafts and your final drafts. And I'll try to usually say this is when I'll try to have red lines back to you. So writers can see, okay, I need to have my stuff by this date, then I have X number of time, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to wait for the red lines to come back. And then I have to have my final drafts in by a certain date. Onyx Path usually goes by a 2 draft system. You almost always will get red lines back, and there's a reason why for that. But I'll get in a second. But generally, you turn a first draft, you'll get red lines back, you'll turn a final draft. Occasionally, the first draft knocks it out of the park, and it's fine. And I just say, cool, you know what? The few things I have aren't going to be valuable to you, so I'll just go ahead and make those changes myself. Occasionally, it takes 3 drafts. I have rarely seen anything go beyond 3 drafts. Part of that reason is, to be perfectly honest, if something takes more than 3 drafts, odds are I'm probably going to have to hire another writer instead. If you're just not getting it after 3 drafts, it's a better use of my time to pay what's called a kill fee, which is that you pay a certain amount because you did at least try to make that effort, and then I hire somebody else to pick up the work because they could probably turn it around faster than me trying to continue to grind on this particular draft. But that happens extremely rarely, to be clear. I think I've had to do that maybe twice in my entire career over 15 years. So it does not happen very often that things click. You almost always 2 drafts is sufficient. And when you get to the redlining stage, I get these first drafts in from writers. They're usually ideally in the same format, but usually they're not. I'd have to get them standardized so that the format looks similar. But then the red line draft there is primarily, it's doing 3 things. The first and most obvious thing a red line is correcting a writer mistake. I am saying the draft it needs to change from this to this. You wrote X, I need it to be Y. And that's the most obvious component of redlining. But it's not the best reason to do red lines. There are developers that I've worked with in the past or that I have peers with who would their attitude is, well, if I'm rewriting this stuff anyway, I might as well just not give it back to the writer and do the work myself. And when you are redlining, most of the time, you're actually doing more work redlining it than just rewriting it. Not entirely true, but in general speaking, it's not working out for whatever reason, and so you're just doing it yourself. And otherwise, redline, you have to spend more time explaining and whatnot. So that I can feel the logic of why red lines, if they take longer and the other writer's doing the work anyway, why don't you do it myself? Because there's the other 2 reasons. The first one is, ideally with red lines, you want to train the writer to do better next time. Because if all's going well, this isn't going to be the first time you work with this writer. Odds are you're probably going to work with them again. This is going to be another project on the road. You don't want them back on board. Maybe it's this exact team. Maybe it's a variation of this team. This person has some really good ideas. You want to help pull them out. You want to educate them on what actually they can do to improve next time. So it's training to a certain degree as well. Is you want to say, okay, I notice you tend to do this. I need you to change it to that instead. One common example I've run into is comma splices. For those of you who don't know, a comma splice is when a sentence is divided by a comma. If you took the comma out and put a period there, you would have 2 completely usable sentences with no change whatsoever. So there shouldn't be a comma there. There should either be a period or a semicolon. Either of those punctuations work, but a comma does not. It is a very common error to make, to the point where some places on the internet feel like it's not even a grammatical error. For my purposes, our style guide doesn't explicitly talk about comma splices. I don't like them. So I say, hey, in future, if you write for me, understand that this is the thing you need to address. The third reason is that so other writers can also learn from the experience. And this goes into an interesting point of red lines. For years, I did not share red lines with a team. I felt like it was an embarrassing situation. It's like sometimes you have to be very curt with a writer, and they don't want to feel like they're being quote unquote called out. And so if I send it just to them, I can have a conversation with them and we can talk things over. As I work more and more in this industry, I'm finding that it makes more sense a lot of times to share the red lines so writers can see the other problems and concerns. Because one of the things that can happen is if one writer is just really going off in a certain direction that's not going to work well with the rest of the project, being able to point to other places in the project that's happening and say, oh, by the way, here's a good example of how that worked out. Gives a chance for the writer to go, oh, okay, now I see it in context. I understand what's happening here. I understand what that means. And they can learn from that. And also, it gives the writers more of a chance to talk amongst themselves and say, oh, hey, I was struggling with this. It seems like you handled that. Can you give me some advice or suggestions? Because this is a team of people working together. And a lot of the reasons why a writer wouldn't want to share those red lines ultimately come down to bad red lines. If a developer is doing red lines badly, or at least in a less productive way, that can lead to a writer not wanting to have that information shared. You want to have a conversation with the writer. So I feel like if you are doing the red lines well, if you're communicating with your writer well, then you don't have to worry as much about whether they're being shared or not. I have certainly, because I am to be what's called a heavy redliner, I tend to do a lot of commentary. I will often warn writers, especially if they've been working before, you're going to see a lot of red on this project, which means you see a lot of changes on this project. Don't freak out, don't be mad. And I usually try to kind of also summarize, here are some areas of concerns, here's things you did well, please keep doing that, but otherwise here are the areas of concerns you need to kind of dig into. Because again, my goal is not to make you feel bad. My goal is to help you get this manuscript to where I need it to be. I'm going to show you some example red lines here. Before we do that, I've been seeing some comments in there. A Flying Brickton mentions that there's too many cooks problem. Yeah, and that can be very true. Particularly, and also comments, I know the feeling I always find something to change in my work, which is another actual valid point. And one of the reasons why this process works really well is that you can't really develop yourself. There are people who say they can, and if they are accurate, I find it suspicious, let's put it that way. I have very rarely seen people who are able to genuinely edit or comment on their own work. More often, you need a fresh pair of eyes, because they're going to see the thing pop right out to them that you've been looking right through your attempts to put this together, or something you thought you wrote down but never actually ended up on the page. That happens a lot to me particularly. So having someone else like a developer who's looking at it fresh and also looking at the whole project in context as opposed to just your small piece is really, really helpful. So again, this redline process shouldn't be something that should be onerous or scary. It should be something that actually is valuable and useful. Dixie in the comments points out, even getting a kill feed doesn't necessarily mean the draft was bad. It means sometimes it wasn't working with the other voices, tones, etc. And that's absolutely true. When I talk about kill fees or finding a new writer, if I've worked with you for 3 drafts, I probably don't think you're a bad writer. I really wanted this to work if I worked with you for that many drafts. So if I'm doing kill feed, just because it's just not working, it's just not clicking. And that brings up another point about the writer team, is that a lot of it is based on personality. There are writers who are fantastic and work great with other developers. They don't work well with me. There are writers that I've had wonderful experiences with, and they go off to work with other developers, and the developers have mixed experiences with them. There are a lot more people who are great for many developers. So, I mean, it's not like it's always, whatever. But sometimes personality does play a factor in things that don't bother Matthew Dawkins might drive me nuts, and make it very difficult for me to want to work with that person. So everyone has their own perspectives, their own approaches, and certainly that team dynamic could be a big part of it. And also Dixie mentions that guess you should put comma slices in the style guide. And like, yes, that would be nice because I do not like them at all. So now I've talked a lot about what red lines are and how they're important and how you do them well or badly. I want to show you a couple of examples. This first one is actually from Monarchies of Mal. It is chapter 2, which is the character creation chapter. And I had Matthew Dawkins write this for me. And I asked his permission first if I can share this because I again, while I feel like sharing red lines is still a valuable thing, not everyone agrees with me, so I want to make sure that when I'm sharing these things that the writer fully consents to it, because even in the ideal world, these things can still be emotionally challenging. So, but this is Matthew's. Matthew did a relatively clean process. When we say by clean copy, means that usually there's not a lot of comments I have to make. But there are enough of variety in this chapter that I thought it's worthwhile to share. So as a character creation chapter, like with Pugmire, Monarchies of Mal, I wanted to start off with ready-made characters, which are 6 characters that I sometimes call the iconic characters, the characters that you see referenced in the arts, in the fiction. They're meant to be seen as kind of inspiration of things. All these are cool characters I could also play. We also give them stats in Monarchies of Mal, so people can literally go, that character seems cool. Oh, here's the stats. I can start playing. I don't have to make a character. It's something I definitely try to work into in the past few years. I try to work into a lot of my core books as having those ready-made, ready-to-play characters you can just dive into. So since this was a character creation chapter, there are some rules components that tie to this and how the characters are built. So one of the things in here you'll see is I mentioned to Matthew, remember to update these character stats based on the changes I mentioned throughout the chapter. And this is something that I do a lot for my red lines specifically, is if I see a trend, I do try to say, hey, remember to check this, remember to do that. My goal isn't to make you feel stupid. My goal is just that there's a lot of moving parts in here, particularly in a dense mechanical chapter like character creation, that it's easy to forget little things like, oh, I need to go back and update my stats. So when I mention these things, again, my goal wasn't to make you feel bad. But something that a developer needs to do is I'm thinking about the whole project. I'm thinking about the larger, how this all fits together. I'm not thinking about just chapter 2. I'm thinking about chapter 1 and chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 6. So there's times where I can also mention things that don't seem like they make sense to what you're asking about, what you're writing, but they're relevant to me for the rest of the book. For example, Matthew puts in, this is our, what we call in-house text. You see sometimes if you see our manuscripts like on Kickstarters or whatnot, you'll see these kind of off-center, all caps, bold things. That's in-house text. That's text that will not show up in the final book. It's there to let editors or layout people or developers know, here's a thought. That changes from these kind of word comments. These are more reserved for the actual relationship between writer and developer. This is more of a thing down the road someone in the process should know. So Matthew here mentions that a page header with a symbol for a footpad, calling for the left and house Rex on the right. Just kind of a note saying, we're doing this thing. It should have this icon, this icon. I cut out the as per page 35 of Pugmire, partially because he does that for every single character and I think it's not relevant. Partially because I know Mike Chaney was laying out this book and he knows what this process looks like, so all he really needs information-wise is what the symbols are. But it's still a good instinct for someone like Matthew to be able to say, I'm referencing this page in this previous book, make sure it looks like that. I have a note here. Again, one of my particular quirks is I try to alphabetize chunks whenever possible. And so in this case, I'll alphabetize the ready-made characters. Right now, they're out in this draft. They're alphabetized by first name, and one alphabetized by surname. But because cats have a complicated name structure, they have a surname and then a Vaughn house name, and not all characters have a surname. I had to kind of clarify. Let's alphabetize these by first surname, which is before the Vaughn if it's there, otherwise after the Vaughn. So that way, there's certain. I'm establishing an alphabetical structure that's a little complicated and hasn't really been addressed in the property before. I had to come up with a ruling on that. Something that we didn't talk about during the outline phase. I read this and go, oh, right, we should probably do this. And that's another point about redlining is I mentioned last episode the outline is not really the final thing. The actual project and product will only it may strongly resemble the outline, but usually there's a lot of change that happens during that process. And this is one of the first places where you'll see that. The writer will come up with a cool thing and the developer go, you know what, let's do that. Or the developer go, actually, no, now that I see it, I really don't want to do that anymore. And sometimes the developers didn't think about a thing that became important as the manuscript started coming together. Sometimes the developer just changes their mind. And that's okay. That's part of the process. And sometimes as the writer, you can push back on that, but a lot of times it's going to be, nah, I really need you to do this versus that. Sometimes I try to not do I try to do copy edit level redlines. So what the difference here is that at the redline stage, a lot of it is going to be structural, tonal changes. I need, as opposed to talking about cats, I need to talk about dogs. As opposed to, these mechanics are working this way and these rules go that way. It doesn't usually make sense at the early stage to start making tiny little copy edit changes, which are much more back to style guide references I made earlier, where we use commas this way and this word versus that word. I don't do it. I don't try to do a ton of that. I end up doing some of it anyway because usually in the process of writing it, it helps set a tone that I'm actually looking for. So, for example, right here, you'll see that I change appreciate Munifa's real talk to appreciate Munifa's straight talk because I felt real talk was just a little too modern of a term. And rather than sit down and explain to Matthew why I made change that one word, it's like, because tonally I felt that real talk was quite whereas straight talk is more appropriate and more setting of the setting and more relevant to the way that these characters probably relate to each other, even though this is not in character text. I still feel like the game, so blah, 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 blah. Or I could just say, change this word. So a lot of times when I'm making those kinds of small changes, usually I'm generally thinking I'm trying to get a particular tone to happen. Other times it's because I'm trying to help teach the writer better writing practices. I tend to prefer punchier, shorter prose in my books. So a lot of times it's like, here's 3 sentences. I can delete those 3 sentences and rewrite it into 8 words. I'll be like, here's a way to do more concision. Also, as an example, if I see the same problem happening over and over, I'll mark the problem throughout, but then I'll rewrite an example or 2 to show them a way that they can make those changes. Other things are just little things that I, as a developer, know about that the writer either forgot about, should have known about, or just didn't think of. In Pugmire, characters start off with a certain amount of equipments, but one of those is an item acquired under unique circumstances. So you can have leather armor, hooded lantern, rations, what have you, but sometimes you get a ring that was discovered on the dead body of a rat, or what have you. And that's something that each of these needed, so I'm able to go through and it's like, that's a thing that readers of this book will expect. It's not here, I need you to add that. Again, it's not something that necessarily Matthew's wrong about doing, it's just he missed that point, and someone else like me come in and say, oh, by the way, you forgot this. Here's another example of a tone edit. I put he's actually quite personable to just he's quite personal. I generally don't like qualifying words like he's almost this or actually this or kind of that. I generally don't like that unless it's trying to do a specific thing, like the character sounds wishy-washy and so it's someone's spoken dialogue that says that, or the text is trying to illustrate that this is a very muddy topic that there's not a lot of consensus on. But almost always I'm going to cut those kinds of words. And that's something that's, again, a preference I have. So I'm editing to the kind of text I want to see. Another example of trends is in the history section of this character, I have a comment of, we have two characters whose mothers died under tragic circumstances, so let's change this to her father. Because within two characters, there are two of them, like so-and-so's mother did blah, blah, blah. And it's like, at least change the gender of the parent involved. Just to make it a little different, because otherwise it can feel like we have no good ideas. It's like every character is, all of them, their parents all died and whatnot. So I'm also helping to kind of give some variety into things. Again, because I'm coming in as a fresh eye, I can look into those kinds of things. I can see those things more easily than the writer can. Another piece I mentioned earlier is that sometimes there's either an element that the developer is aware of, the writer isn't, or there's just a structural change that happens in the book. And this is one of them. In the beginning of each of the character classes, which in Pugmire are called callings, but in general we call splats. This is the 2-page spread or the 4-page spread you get that tells you what kind of character you're going to be. Those are generally called splats. And for Pugmire in particular, we had a quotes at the top. And a lot of our games we have character quotes. Matthew had attributed them to the iconic characters, and I specifically wanted them to be new characters because we already have 6 characters that show you what each of the callings look like as examples. I want to then have these breakdowns to be different characters, so you say, oh, champions are not just Nirma von Korat. Their champions can also be this character and this character and this character. So I wanted to show a variety. And so by having that quote not be from that, but actually from a new character that hasn't been referenced yet. And this does a couple of things. One is I mentioned, the iconics are covering the pre-generated characters. Let's use a space to showcase new characters. That's one. It's a design choice I had. But the other piece is I knew this was going to Kickstarter. And one of our common Kickstarter goals is people can contribute a large amount of money to have their cat's name put into a book. And these quote attributions are a very easy way to do that. Similarly, you send me kind of a write-up of their character's personality. Usually it's many paragraphs about their cat's personality, but from that I can say, okay, that sounds kind of like Ratter or whatever. This in the case of the champion. I can take the quote, rewrite it a little bit, drop the name in, done. It fulfills what we need to do for the Kickstarter. It's a nice, easy place to find that Kickstarter backer name because you can easily turn to it and point to it, not buried in the text anywhere. So whenever possible, I'd like to use these spaces to allow for things like Kickstarter backers' names to show up. A piece that I had not articulated to Matthew, and I don't think anyone was really thinking about, so I say, hey, is it another thing that was in my head? So I have to kind of make sure that Matthew's aware of that. This is another point, is I highlight a section here and I say I like this. There is a style of development that I do not agree with, which is that the more blunt and aggressive your red lines are, the more the writer will understand that you are disappointed and need to change that. I completely disagree with this philosophy. I've done it when I was younger. I've been on the receiving end of it. And ultimately I found it just makes you feel bad. It doesn't make you want to work with that person anymore. So I generally try to write my red lines to be constructive, to explain this is what I want. Not, oh, this sucks, change it. That's not helpful. No one gets any benefit from that red line. But to say, instead of what you've written here, I need you to write something that's punchier. Here's an example. I try to go for illustrative rather than punitive red lines. Part and parcel of that is that I try, I'm not always good at this, but I try to also say, I really enjoy something. Please keep this. Because sometimes in the creative process, when you get feedback on something, someone will say, hey, could you change this piece? And then as the writer, you're going, actually, if I change that, then I probably should change these 3 or 4 other things, or it changes the tenor or the tone of what I was trying to say here. So sometimes a small comment can lead to larger scale change. So I've found it's useful for me to say, if you do make changes, keep this bit. I like this bit. And make sure that it stays in the manuscript somewhere. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the most obvious one, is that obviously I can make sure that stuff that I really enjoyed and thought was brought value to it stays in. But the more important part is it's nice because red lines are scary. I've been doing this since 2001, right? I've been doing this for almost 20 years now. I still get a little bit of anxiety when I get red lines back, even from people I've worked with for decades. Because it's always like, oh, they're going to hate it, and I don't want to look at it, and I sometimes even put it off. So opening up and knowing that it's like, oh, hey, this is really cool, and I like this, is really heartening, because it's like, okay, there's stuff here that the developer really enjoyed, as well as stuff that they need to have changed. Obviously, I can't do that for everything, because sometimes there isn't stuff I like, or it's not strong enough for me to call it out. And also sometimes I get so in the weeds of making sure that everything is going the way it needs to that I sometimes forget to say, oh, by the way, yeah, that was great. So some of it is still on me as a person to kind of learn and be better about, but some of it is also, I can't always do I like this, work on this, I like this kind of sandwich, a feedback sandwich. Sometimes it's just, no, we need to do some work on this. But again, the tone is important. It's not useful, and it's not great use of anyone's time for me to be a jerk about it. So I'd rather have the writer come and want to be enthusiastic about the changes rather than dreading what my comments are. So as I'm skimming through here, you'll notice there was a couple of minor points. We're starting to get into some bigger red lines here. And this was the Mancers. Because the Mancers were a new concept, and it was frankly something that we struggled with nailing down when I did the early access version of this. Mancers and Miniatures both, I wanted them to be equivalent to Pugmire characters, but not identical to them. And I felt like Banshees and Ministers was something that I didn't quite communicate across. And Matthew took a stab at it, and it didn't quite work for me. For example, little things like the fact that there's the assumption that all Mancers are necromancers. And that's kind of where it came from. But they're also pyromancers. They're also lunomancers. There are also Mancers. Mancer as a suffix covers a lot of different kinds of magical schools, and I wanted to kind of reflect that. And these are generic magic users, not generic, but very diverse magic users. But there's also this stigma that a lot of people believe they're necromancers, which is part of the reason why the name sticks in both directions. So one is like clarifying. Not derived from necromancer. It's derived from all kinds of magicians. That's important, but we do need to have that necromancer piece there. Another one is Matthew had a sentence here that the rest of the paragraph did not build on. If you remember high school composition, you have a sentence that sets the concept or the expectation of what you're trying to explain, and then you explain it through the rest of the paragraph. That's not constant and required, but if you set up a sentence where you're making statements, it's implied that the rest of the paragraph will then build on that statement. So if it doesn't, we need to work on that. In this case, it actually just was cleaner to just cut that sentence entirely and just ditch it. The paragraph was not harmed by the removal of the sentence. It actually was improved by it. Another one is Matthew wrote a lot of these little kind of sub-factions for each of the callings, which was a really cool thing. For space purposes, they ultimately got cut from the final layout of Monarchies of Mao. But in this example, again, because he was thinking very heavily necromantic components, a lot of these were based on death. And it's like, really only one of them should be, because, again, I wanted that flavor of these are different kinds of magicians. So when I'm giving these as kind of piecemeal examples because I want to, these are the kinds of thoughts that I'm thinking about as a developer. And again, yes, I could have made all these changes myself and then just given the writer, or not even given the writer the draft and just say, cool, I got it, thanks, and changed it and put it in the final book. But then Matthew had no context for why I made those changes. If he writes out another Realms Pugmire book, which he did, he has no way of knowing that these are things that need to change in general. He will know better what kinds of questions to ask me when it comes to the Realms of Pugmire project, because we've had these kinds of notes and conversations. So he becomes a better Realms of Pugmire writer for me if I take this extra time and effort. Again, another example of nice. I'm going to jump ahead here because there's another point down here. This is one example of adding in. A lot of my comments thus far have been change this, modify this, let's need to go run. Sometimes I'll just drop a sentence or even a paragraph in because I'm trying to bridge to another point. I feel like there's maybe two sudden of shifts, so I'm kind of write a bridge in there, or there's another piece of information that's the rest of the book maybe you need to know about. So, for example, Matthew is talking here about names in the monarchies and how cats' different houses work and how their surnames work. 'Cause again, it's a complicated topic. It's not as obvious. And he covered all the different houses, didn't mention the Shadow Block, which is kind of a seventh informal faction. And that was, again, a problem that happened throughout the project because the 6 houses of the monarchies were so iconic and easy to understand and visual and just a strong image that the Shadow Block being kind of, and everybody else is over here, occasionally got lost. And so something that I as developer had to do throughout the Redlining process, say, no, remember these guys too. They're just as cool. They're just as interesting. They have a place in the monarchies. Make sure we're not forgetting them. So those are the kinds of things that also are important to do during the development process. And this is a good example of when I talk about I'm getting heavy in red lines, is sometimes I have lengthy comments. This is actually not as heavy as I get sometimes, but still you see a lot of red on the page. That can be scary as a writer. But it's something sometimes I have to point out a lot of things. And sometimes those comments come in short successions. I have to kind of have lots of comments and notes. But yeah, I try to note when I have things I really liked and really enjoyed. And sometimes you see a lot of red just because, oh, this is all awesome. This is all great. Make sure you don't lose this stuff. But sometimes I have to show, and like say word comments, I like to highlight whenever possible, all of the context of my comments. So sometimes I have to do paragraphs and paragraphs to say all of this is a concern or all of this is really good, but get rid of the rest. So I have these really long things that's just like, let's scale back. In this case, it was the Cats of Smilodon were kind of a lingering background antagonist that I wanted to kind of make sure that it was referenced and known, but also they're a secret. They're not well known inside the game world itself. So the book had to constantly say, hey, here's this cool thing you can play with. But also the characters couldn't be too wrapped up in it. In this case, I thought Matthew went too far the other way, where Smilodon became the reason why everything is terrible. And it's like, no, there are other things too. So let's scale that back. But I had to, again, kind of show, here's all the stuff you talked about, the mention of Smilodon. Let's cut all that down. So it can look scary, but it's not meant to be. So in the interest of fairness, I'm going to show you now Matthew's red lines to me. Partially because I think a good developer is someone who continues to write and continues to receive red lines from developers, because that way you're always knowing what it's like as a writer to receive them, and it helps you be a developer. But also, it's a good chance for me to showcase some different styles between Matthew and I. So Monarchies of Mal, Matthew wrote for me in 2017. This is for V5 Cults of Blood Gods, which happened last year. So it's been 2 years since I gave my red lines to Matthew. But even then, you can see Matthew and I have a good working relationship. And so he's able to kind of say things and do things in this. He'd be a little more candid with me than perhaps maybe some of his other writers. And he generally tends to be. So, for example, in this case, I was doing the bloodlines and lore sheets for cults. And the original material I had allocated to me was a bit short. And so instead of me going, well, I'm got everything in, I'm done, I basically said, I am about 400 or 500 words short. Do you want me to add more material to the existing stuff I have, pad it out a bit more? Is there something you see that you need to, I just completely got wrong, I need to redo? Or should I add one more lore sheet to this? And in this case, Matthew's like, you can reintroduce Naharaja or one of these Saharan African Cappadocians. Says like, yes, I looked through this. You still have 400 words left, so let's add some more material here. And that's occasionally a case where a third draft might possibly have happened. But luckily, because Matthew and I work well together, I was able to knock it in. He just gave me a couple minor comments and we moved on. So it wasn't really a full third draft. It's like, here's an extra thing. Let's double check that. But this was also my second book for V5 that I worked on. And the first one was Chicago by Night, and I wrote characters. And so a lot of that was figuring out what the format of the characters was going to be. It was the first real non-White Wolf generated source book for V5. So a lot was figuring things out. And as a result, I did not internalize a lot of the actual style of V5. So, for example, I was on the assumption that much like for Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition, I just shortened it to V20. I thought we were doing it for V5. It's not. It is Vampire the Masquerade. So when you reference 5th edition Vampire the Masquerade in the book, you have to spell out Vampire the Masquerade in bold. That's the style. So he corrected me on this. You see there's a couple of those right here because I was trying to reference existing rules. And also little things like Lorshie's capitalized. Embrace has been capitalized, not capitalized in various editions. Apparently it is capitalized in this edition. So these are things that, to be blunt, I should have known and taken care of before I got to Matthew. As a writer, I should have researched this. I should have gotten that information. I should have put it into my draft. I didn't. And Matthew is correctly changing those as developer. This is a different thing from, like I mentioned before, these aren't copy edit level edits. This is Matthew saying, this is a style for V5. So if you do more V5 products, you should know Lorshie is capitalized, Embrace is capitalized. This is how you reference book pages. This is him training me how to be a better V5 writer for future projects. So this is why this is important, because now I have this reference. I will know that going forward, assuming I remember. But ideally, I will have that going forward, and therefore I'll not make those mistakes as often. And then therefore, that's less work that Matthew has to do on his next red lines for me. So that's why training your writers is a really important thing you want to do. But also, Matthew is really good at praise, much better than I am, I feel. He will definitely, like, 3 I like this is creative, this is brutal, but in a good way. He really liked the mechanics that came up with for the lore sheets, and so he wanted to really showcase that he felt like these were doing well. Here's another example of that thing I showed you earlier where I wrote a sentence to kind of add on a point or to bridge between 2 paragraphs. Matthew does the same thing here. He wants to make sure that the children of Tenochtitlan, I'm sure I got that wrong, but he want to make sure that they note that these vampires existed before the Giovanni, and that what they had doesn't matter to the Giovanni family. So these kinds of things are actually, you see Matthew and I both do them. Now, some of that is Matthew and I have worked well together, and a lot of, when he first started becoming a developer, I helped him with a lot of his advice, suggestions. He got a lot of red lines from me, so some of it is he's picked up some of this from me as a result. But some of this also is just Matthew's particular style. He likes to point out things that go well when he sees them. And again, but this whole adding a quick sentence in to kind of illustrate a point is something that I do too. So he may have picked it up from me, he may have already did it, I don't know, but it's something that I know I do. Another mention here is a nice solid range of powers. In my style, I would probably just scroll past. Matthew takes the extra time to say, these are particularly good. Another one, like he mentions, like this is a bizarre power for which I have a strange affection. So it's like, I didn't know if I was going to like this, but I think I do. But again, we have a relationship, so he's kind of telling me, I feel a little interesting about this. I'm not sure. I think I like it. Or like in this case, an interesting connection. It's like he approves it, he thinks it's good, but also I didn't think about that. He's much more kind of conversational in his red lines, and sometimes I tend to be a little more kind of declamatory. But also like things like incomplete sentence. Certainly even though this is, you see a lot of praise here, there's still corrections. There's still things that I need to change. This is not a good phrasing. Like callback. Double check on whether this is familia versus familia. That was an interesting point. And a good last comment is I've talked a lot about, as a developer, communicating to your writer and saying, this is the thing that you need to do to change it. Understand that it is a two-way street. The writer can go back to the developer with concerns, but also that two-way street is not the same. In this case, the spelling of it, Matthew was like, it's a little more Italian American. Maybe it should be more Italian. We actually had to talk about that. I pushed back on it. I actually don't remember what the result is. I think we actually went with Familia. Because I think he had a good point on that. But sometimes I expect writers, I'll try to broadcast in red lines. I'm not sure where to go with this. What do you think? I try to make it clear that there's a question here. And like Matthew does here, I wonder if this should be. I'll say things like, what do you think? To make it clear to the writer, I do want your input on this. I am conflicted. Let me know what your thoughts are. I do want to see both sides of that. And if there's something you just don't agree with, certainly as a writer, say, hey, I saw you did this red line. I'm not sure that's the right direction. Let me tell you why. None of that is bad. I always believe communication is important between a writer and developer, between any freelancers working on a project, any creative teams working together. But at the end of the day, the developer is the one that has to make the call. And if you don't like it and the developer goes, cool, we're doing it anyway, then as a professional, that writer should go ahead and do that anyway. As a developer, you should not be dictatorial. You should not say it will always go my way, because you're going to make mistakes, and having other people thinking about this stuff is going to just make your project better. But at the same time, someone has to make the final call, and that is developer, that is you. So red lines is a great time to have a conversation, to start the conversation, to see which pieces are a little wobbly. But also at this point, the developer usually has a decent idea of where it's going, because like in my case, I read red lines, if possible, from beginning to end. I try to read in order that a player would read the book, so that way I can notice things like, we talked about this topic in chapter 2, but we need to find it in chapter 4. We need to switch those around or whatever. So by the time I read through, I'll also sometimes go back and update or change red lines to other writers based on what I read later in the book. But because I've done all that work, I have a decent idea of where this project now needs to go. We've already been through the outline phase. We've all signed off on an outline. Now I'm looking at what is much closer to a final project. So if I'm saying, nah, I really need you to do this, I may have lots of reasons that I may not be able to go into, or I just can't articulate. I try to whenever possible, and I think developers should try to articulate why they're making the decisions they make, but sometimes you just can't. Sometimes the answer is just the thing needs to change. So with that is red lines. Both me and Matthew and our terrible writing. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. I'll scroll back up and see if there's any I missed. Let's see. I already mentioned Nixie's going to put comma splices in the style guide, because she said that's happening, so now that's official and will never change. Flying Brickton mentioned that I wrote a goose nest for Pugmire that took a few sweeps. I'm working on a Canis Minor version. That's definitely a valid point, that it should take a few passes, a few drafts, as it were, to get through. You're never going to get it right the first time. Certainly, I can't think of a time where I just been like, nope, I completely nailed it. Nothing needs to change. That is never true to my knowledge. There's certain times where I feel like I got it pretty strong and there's only minor things I need to change. Sometimes it just comes out and it's like, oh, that actually worked out pretty well. But usually there's a lot more self-loathing there. And it's just like, no, this is terrible. Everything I write is awful. Someone else should fix this and make it better. Don't feel bad that you have to take a few stabs at something, because that's how the process works and how everything gets better. Matt McElroy mentioned he's a big fan of ready-made characters, and he should be, because he was a big proponent for them back in the day. In fact, for a while we had, with Chronicles of Darkness, we had a separate sellable ready-made characters, and I believe he was the person that actually mentions or advocated for them. I think maybe the person actually first suggested them. But the idea that having them outside the book as an add-on product was something he's always been a big, strong advocate for. And now actually adding them into the book is something that's been more recent, relatively speaking, in the past, say, 3-4 years. So yeah, he's not a surprise that he's a fan of the RMCs. The Onyx Path, Ian has mentioned that Trinity is now about mimes. Please revise your drafts accordingly. Well, Ian, you're the content lead, so I guess Trinity's about mimes now. So you get to make that call. It's not going to be about mimes. Ian is wrong. But yeah, there are no other comments in there, so I'll just mention that next week I'm going to go more into the paradoxically named development phase. You would think that all of this is development, and that's true, but there is an actual phase kind of after editing. So I'll talk about what the editing process is like, what it's like working with an editor, what the post-editing development stage is all about, and basically everything from the writers have turned in a final draft to you're handing it out to layout. So that's all going to be in 2 weeks, and I will see you all then. Thank you very much for hanging out.